Good afternoon, everyone. We are about to start our penultimate session, and it's on the theme of logistics and letters. Now, yesterday, talked about Jack Elder's transatlantic voyage, 7 voyages across the Atlantic in one direction or another, yet none of them particularly eventful, at least from his diary, none of them of any real consequence. Yet we know, sadly, for many people, there were difficulties and there were tragedies in the Atlantic crossing. And that is going to be looked at, the story behind the Titanic is going to be the first of our talks this afternoon. It's by William Blair. Now, William first joined National Museum's NI back in 2009 as Head of Human History. And since 2017, he has been the Director of Collections at NMNI, and his specific responsibility for curatorial collections management and education. So I'm delighted to welcome William to the podium now to speak on Titanic Behind the Legend. Thank you, William.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity of contributing to the symposium. I must say it says much about the kind of powers of persuasion of Liam Campbell that he's managed to kind of persuade me to come out of retirement and talk about Titanic, which I haven't really had to think about for I've been in recovery actually for over 10 years now, so but it's been quite cathartic in its own way, and we actually are loaning to an exhibition in Germany next year, so I actually have had to think about it a bit, for another reason as well. But like what I will say today, some of it may be hopefully relevant to the theme of the symposium. I'm kind of rather programmed just to think about Titanic in one particular way, so to speak. I'm a bit of a one-trick pony. So some of it may be more relevant than other content, but anyway, this my kind of encounter with Titanic really dates back to 2010 when I was tasked with the development of a new exhibition at Cultraw at the Ulster Transport Museum. It wasn't something I didn't have any particular background in kind of maritime history, and I kind of felt, I suppose, like most people, that the Titanic is actually quite a simple story. Everybody knows it. What is there really to be said? But actually, I kind of find that on one level, it's a very deceptive story because it's something that's very easily summarized. You can do so in a couple of lines, but it's actually, there's a depth and a complexity to Titanic which surprised me. You can frame the story in many ways, and and I suppose that's what we tried to do with the exhibition and the program at that time. It is to quote a mythic tale of epic proportions, but it does also combine modern dimensions of international business and high finance, and the role of mass media and human interest stories. And there's the exhibition. It's still there. It's aged quite well. So if you're in Cultraw and you're interested, it is worth a visit.
Sorry, is this in the Ulster Museum or in Titanic exhibition? Do you mean?
It's in the Ulster Transport Museum.
Oh, the Ulster Transport
at Cultraw.
Sorry.
No, we have no connection with the Titanic visitor attraction.
Sorry.
Well, we do have a sort of, in a sense, a certain, but not a. It's we're not partnered with it. It's we're David, they're Goliath kind of thing. So. The slingshot is the fact that we have the original artifacts. That's the kind of. But anyway, so why build Titanic? Like, it's interesting, I think, that Titanic arguably in some ways was not in itself a particularly significant event, you know, in the sense that it didn't change that much. Changed, I suppose, how people thought about safety at sea, and that's important. But it wasn't like the Yalta Conference, or, you know, it wasn't sort of something that actually you could say, well, that's changed, you know. And in some ways it is almost like the tale of two ships, because there's the reality of Titanic in terms of the story of, you know, why it was built and how it was built and where it was built, and actually the fateful voyage and what happened, you know, in terms of the, you know, it's sinking. But actually when it sank, almost as soon as the waters closed over the stern, you know, another ship emerged, and that's Titanic in terms of how it has been encoded in our popular culture, in our, you know, it's an incredibly powerful, compelling story. It is in that sense a modern myth, you know, there's all sorts of meaning and symbolism kind of that's been invested in Titanic. And in that sense, you know, that mythic kind of aspect of Titanic is incredibly powerful. But it does almost kind of contrast with the reality, in the sense that, you know, Titanic, you know, in the popular mind, it's often seen as a kind of, people sometimes think of it as a ploughing through the Atlantic almost as on its own. This ship kind of just making its way at stately progress to New York, when in reality the North Atlantic was a busy highway. You know, there was a multitude of shipping lanes. You know, there was constant traffic of ships going back and forward. You know, which is one of the reasons why nobody ever thought you'd need lifeboats to take everybody. You know, because the assumption was, which wasn't unreasonable, that you'd need enough lifeboats to kind of be able to get people to whatever would be the first ship to arrive, you know, if you were in trouble, to actually kind of, and you'd be just ferrying your passengers to the next, you know, to a ship to kind of, to get, you know, to, you know, kind of as a, you know, to be rescued. But nobody imagined that actually a ship would sink and nobody'd come to your help. But, you know, in that sense, actually Titanic comes out of a very pragmatic kind of world of business. You know, a very competitive world of kind of transatlantic shipping. The White Star Line, you know, had been acquired by International Mercantile Marine, you know, one of a number of lines. International Mercantile Marine was owned by J.P. Morgan, you know, J.P. Morgan of, you know, who you'd be all familiar with, you know, was trying to basically build monopolies in a sense, had actually established the first, you know, $1 billion business in US steel. You know, it was, you know, the relationship between the White Star Line and the Harland and Wolff had existed for 50 years before the building of Titanic. You know, Titanic didn't come out of a process of revolution, it was an evolution. And the experience of travelling at sea across the Atlantic, if you did it in the 1860s, it was pretty ropey. You're like, you know, it's really not going to be a pleasant experience. You know, you wouldn't be that far away maybe from, you know, livestock, you know, or whatever. You know, it's just a very, very basic. But actually in the 50 years leading up to, you know, the construction of the Olympic class ships, you know, that experience of travel was transformed, and it became much more comfortable for everybody on board, you know, and that was kind of, and it was very lucrative. So that's the board of the partners of Harland and Wolff kind of really, I suppose, at their pomp. You know, you've got Edward Harland on the right hand side as you look at it. Gustav Wolff, Wilson kind of is the guy with a moustache, and Perry is the guy with a beard seated on the table, who was in many ways the kind of Bill Gates of his time, William Perry, and Thomas Ismay there, who was the founder of the White Star Line. So this is a relationship, really profitable, really successful relationship They never signed a contract. It was always a handshake. It was always worked on the basis of a certain commission. They'd build the ships and they'd charge a kind of a sort of a commission on top of it. And that was how they worked, and it never really changed. But actually what was driving it fundamentally, it was, transatlantic emigration. And that's, in some ways, I think a nice photograph showing just kind of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island kind of in around, early part of the 20th century kind of, and, you can see, I think it's very evocative. It's what they're carrying, their suitcases, kind of, that's why the ships were getting bigger, because the volume of people was getting progressively larger. And I think sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's nearly 1 million people each year in the early 1900s, kind of making that kind of coming to the United States. So it's a big, and then you have obviously the first class and second class, because the only way of kind of getting from Europe to United States was by sea. So the first and second class passengers, are another part of the business model, and they generate revenue in their own way, kind of, and in some ways that explains why the ships were designed and constructed in the way that they were. There's J.P. Morgan. He actually didn't fund the Olympic class ships. He's notoriously shrewd. He didn't actually put any of his own money into it. It was kind of the White Star Line had to mortgage their fleet in order to build the Olympic class ships, and the Olympic class was, Olympic was the first, Titanic was the second, and then ultimately Britannic as the third, but, it was a gamble, really, and it was in response just to kind of, the competition that they were facing, particularly from Cunard, because Cunard would not play ball with J.P. Morgan, that Cunard remained independent, remained kind of British owned, and, so like in some ways, J.P. Morgan, International Mercantile Marine, arguably overpaid for this White Star Line, and the White Star Line kind of, in terms of, the decision, the decision to kind of commission Olympic class ships was a calculated risk, really, but one that they felt they had to take, and stretch themselves to. That's International Mercantile Marine. So it was 1907 when Bruce Ismay met with William Perry in his home in Downshire House in London. And they kind of conceived, Perry was always kind of had this ambition to build a kind of 1,000-foot kind of, liner, ship. And, they, it was over dinner, they agreed, and they kind of that, to commission these 3 ships that would together, that running as a 3, together kind of work that transatlantic route. The Harland Wolff shipyard was really, in many ways, the Cape Canaveral of its day. It was a huge industrial enterprise. Probably the business model today, you'd describe it as vertical integration. It was kind of because they wanted to build, make everything they possibly could in the shipyard. Which included, the seats, the soft furnishings, the sort of, and, other things were kind of supplied by particular suppliers, like the kind of light fittings and some of the dinner services, etc. But anything that they could make in the yard, they made it in the yard in order to just increase the profit margin. And, size mattered, it was kind of, the whole kind of idea of, these, with the Olympic class, the promotion around the scale, the size, the kind of the luxury, the qualities was kind of all part of a very sophisticated marketing effort, and that's a photograph of Titanic under construction. Quite an evocative photograph in terms of just the sort of, you have the wooden ship in the foreground, the enormous Harold gantry, which was specially kind of commissioned and built just for the Olympic class. Like everything had to be scaled up for the Olympic class ships. The workforce, Like anyone with even a passing, awareness of Irish politics knows that the shipyard was always a barometer in many respects for politics at the time and sectarian tensions at the time, and often these things were played out kind of very, violently at the yard. But, there they are, kind of all wearing, everyone wore a hat, of course, in 19, and, the workforce, they're all in their Belfast dunchers. The supervisors wore a bowler hat. They were called the hats. And then the ship would have, when they turned up at the openings, they were wearing their top hats. So like hats, there's a paper, some to be written about hats. Like one of the things we also tried to do was to kind of some ways bring it back to quite personal stories as well, and we kind of collected with that in mind. This is John Kelly, who was one of 5 shipyard workers who lost their lives during the construction of the ship. He was only 19. He was described as a lather boy. I'm not really sure what a lather boy does, but he fell kind of, from and working on the ship and died of his injuries, and it's very poignant to think we think of the disaster and the loss of life at sea, but actually kind of, it was a very dangerous working environment as well. And so life on board, these are, first class, second class, third class toast racks. That's actually really first class plus. There's that because you could upgrade on Titanic from first class to, if you wanted to kind of, if you bought a first class ticket, you could be eating in the first class dining room, all for your whole voyage. But if you wanted an extra degree of exclusivity, you'd eat in the a la carte restaurant. Kind of, there was like where you would, pay additionally for that extra level of exclusivity. So if you were like an Astor or a Guggenheim or whatever, you would actually want to get. So it's very modern in that sense, but like kind of, modern flight. You can go business class. You can upgrade. Like you can keep upgrading, your kind of travel. So it's interesting. And third class, I don't know whether it's sort of, you can see it on the, I find menus really interesting because I think they say a lot about, and one of the myths in some ways is that third class, everybody travelled well in Titanic. Third class passengers travelled very well. And everybody ordered their food off a menu. And everybody was served by uniformed stewards and stewardesses. That was standard. Obviously if you're in the first class, it'll be a different menu, but fundamentally, those principles of customer service kind of applied whatever class you travelled. It's interesting in the breakfast there, you can have Quaker oats and milk. This isn't Titanic, but it's one of the ships that's broadly contemporary. Smoked herring, jacket potatoes. This is for breakfast. Curried beef and rice. I haven't had curry for breakfast since I've been a student, and it's usually cold on a plate lying on the carpet. But
Curry or the student?
probably both. But it says there, and I can't quite read it, but it says, if at the bottom, if you have any cause to complain, you do so. Like in that sense, if you were kind of like, if you're not getting the service, this is third class, if you're not getting a level of service that if you've been in any way, kind of take the number of the steward and complain. Like there are very few Irish actually on the Titanic. It was kind of, and like I'm in a room here of people that know a lot more about emigration than I do, but really by that stage the major emigration was coming from Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia. I'm looking for reassurance here, Liam, kind of it's Paddy, kind of, and it wasn't, but there were a lot of kind of, sort of Jewish people on, that were actually fleeing persecution in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's interesting that on the Titanic, on the Olympic class, there was kind of special, part of the kitchen just preparing kosher food, like was really focused in terms of, looking after the particular needs of their customers. And you can see there that's kind of called kosherware. It's actually the table service that would have been used, to provide, and it's actually I wrongly attributed at one stage to kind of Hebrew. It's not. It's in Yiddish, but it just shows, just in a sense, that level of customer service and how modern really the kind of the thinking in terms of customer service was. First class staterooms, you could actually pick your style, you'd actually, if you could pick a different, and you could actually, they were modular, so you could actually, if you wanted, you could keep increasing it, and if you didn't want to leave your stateroom, your suite, you could just stay there the whole trip. And if you really had upgraded to the point where there's even part you could actually have access to your own private promenade on the outside on the deck. So you really wouldn't have had any reason to, if you didn't want to mix with anybody else, you could just stay with your immediate travellers and, have, be exclusive, entirely exclusive. And third class cabins, again, comfortable, everything branded, White Star Line. It very much, with immigrants, the key was actually giving them a really good experience on board, because they knew that kind of immigrants were going to be writing back to their families. And that's actually a very effective way, part of marketing. If you write back to your family and say, I've just been on this amazing ship, if you're coming over, travel White Star Line, it's the best. That actually is why there's postcards and writing paper all branded with the, there's a plentiful supply, because they were encouraging people to be writing. They wanted people to be writing. So the voyage itself I'll not dwell on, but William Bell, he was his distinction was that he worked on both Olympic, Titanic and Britannic as a fitter, and was on the ship when it sailed from Belfast to Southampton. Was very disappointed that he wasn't able to make the crossing, bitterly disappointed. Little did he know. Nicknamed Dinger, of course, It's an interesting what-if moment, nearly hit the sort of another ship in Southampton. If it had, this letter from a second-class passenger describes the moment. Marconi himself actually was one of the people after the sinking. Every time you see a photograph or any film, he was smiling, because this was such a boost for Marconi. And Marconi's shares just went, it was it was great for Marconi as a business, that it was Marconigrams that actually did, the loss, again, third class passenger Rosa Abbott, the only woman to be actually retrieved out of the water and then onto a lifeboat and ultimately saved. And in myth and memory, in many ways, the way that Titanic's was encoded at the time in 1912 to 14, was very much about trying to make sense out of, make meaning out of what was really a a random, rather unlikely event. So there was a lot of cultural meaning, in the way the story was reanimated in popular culture at the time. It very much tried to emphasize the values of Edwardian society, particularly the upper class, particularly Anglo-Saxon males, be British, the last words of Captain Smith, apparently, it was almost like, in some ways, the Diana effect, the way in which the news was received and how it triggered, the emotions that it triggered, and then how there was almost an industry that catered to it, in terms of this is one of a set of lantern slides. This in the other corner there's a what you now call a celebrity fundraiser at Covent Garden. Memorials, that's the one in Belfast in the inset there before it was moved into the grounds of the City Hall because of traffic. The book by Walter Lord, produced by William McQuitty, who was from Bangor, grew up, actually saw the ship being launched as a small boy, which was part of what drew him to the story. He then bought up the rights to make the film of A Night to Remember, kind of completely rebooted Titanic in popular consciousness. Seminal kind of film, the best film in my opinion. But Kenneth Moore as second officer, Lighthauler, who actually kind of was the guy that really screwed up the lifeboats. But actually, because it's Kenneth Moore, everybody, like, he's one of the heroes, ironically. It always delineates into heroes and villains, Titanic. And there it is, kind of, that was, the wreck was discovered in 1985. And, you know, the Cameron film followed in 1997. And now we have Titanic Visitor Centre in Belfast, so we're kind of, you know, as a powerful symbol of the vibrant tourist economy of post-conflict Northern Ireland. So there you go. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, William, for bringing out the human element of the story. I mean, the glamour and so on, and the famous 1997 film, but I would agree with you entirely, William. A Night to Remember is the best film on the Titanic. And reminding us as well that it was built as an immigrant ship. It was intended to be a very important part of the immigrant trade. And I was listening to a podcast not so long ago by Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland. They were talking about some of the experiences, and there was one particular story that really struck them and really struck me listening to it. But it was about a young man, a youth from Eastern Europe, travelling on the Titanic with his parents, and on the first night he turned 14, and for his 14th birthday he was given a pair of long trousers. And of course, in a very sad way, those trousers sealed his fate, because he was now a man, not a boy, and he didn't make it. Our next speaker, Professor Ron Roach from East Tennessee State University. I first met Ron last July when I joined him and Liam and Paddy and Jane and some of their students from Tennessee on an excursion to Donegal. We were in Ramelton in the sunshine, but it started to rain in Rathmullen, and it got progressively heavier as we headed up the Fanad Peninsula, at the point where we simply could not even see the sea. But when we reached Fanad Lighthouse, the sun came out, and that photograph was taken when we reached Fanad Lighthouse. And Liam doesn't mind me saying this, but in terms of his own personal family story and family migration story, Liam's mother was born in this room here at Fanad Lighthouse. So, Ron, delighted to welcome you, and please come forward, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, William, and so nice to see you again. And that was a brilliant day, absolutely, at Fanad Lighthouse. And we're going to talk about a slightly older technology than Titanic as we think about railroads. I will point out that I am in no way an expert on railroads or railroad history. Liam asked me to speak on this topic primarily because I'm helping to organize a railroad museum back in Johnson City, Tennessee. But I think it is a very appropriate topic, and I'd like to ask, how many of you kept account of how many times railroads were mentioned yesterday in all of the accounts we heard from those immigrants? Anyone? Well, I didn't either. But it was a lot, wasn't it? Because when you consider the question why, certainly after about 1850, you have to consider railroads, because they were such a major part of immigration, not only as vehicles, but as a groundbreaking new technology that had a huge impact on culture, on communication, on connections, and the movement of people. And as Christina so eloquently pointed out yesterday, and I've enjoyed reading through part of her book and talking with her. I'm ordering a copy of it. I recommend it. These railroads functioned also as powerful corporations, and they exerted a major influence in conjunction, of course, with global and national political and economic forces. So the title of my talk, Long Steel Rail, if there are any folk music fans in the audience, is taken from the book by Norm Cohen, which is probably the best book on the railroad in folk music. I have long had an interest in railroads and the seminal impact that they had on development and during this whole time period. This is a photograph I took in Johnson City, Tennessee. Liam, you might recognize the building over there, which contains the White Duck Taco Stand and Yeehaw Brewery. But I was never there. It is. You were never there, but it is a former railroad depot that's been converted into a restaurant. Johnson City, where our university is located, exists because of the railroad. What is now the Southern Railway came through. It was then the Virginia and Tennessee Railway, came following the Shenandoah Valley and then branched off into Tennessee. And that railroad was built, and they needed a water tank at this point. And an enterprising young man named Henry Johnson built a water tank, and it developed into Johnson City. Eventually, 3 railways converged at Johnson City, and so it became sort of the industrial center of that part of Tennessee, and ultimately the home of East Tennessee State, directly as a result of that railroad. Even further back, though, my hometown, Reedsville, North Carolina, a tobacco and textile town, but it came into existence because of the railway, because during the Civil War, there was no connecting railway between Greensboro, North Carolina, and Danville, Virginia. The Confederacy built that railway to transport goods and troops, and that developed into the town. And in the 1920s, my grandfather, who lived in Virginia, and we're talking about internal migration now, because he could not make a living on the family farm, he traveled down the railway and became an employee at that time, the world's largest cigarette factory of the American Tobacco Company, and worked his entire career there. By the way, I grew up in a neighborhood about 2 blocks to your right there off of the screen, hearing train whistles all day and all night long. Then my grandmother, who grew up near the Smoky Mountains National Park in western North Carolina when she was 17 years old, she would have seen an ad very similar to this one, and advertising for workers. And if you notice the wording of the advertisement, it gets into some of the techniques for recruitment that these corporations were using at that time. Cash paid for all labor. The moral character of parties employed must be clean and all right. For further information, call on or address. But she took a train from western North Carolina by herself to this town, got a job at the Edna Cotton Mills, met my grandfather, and as a result of the railroad and internal migration, I am here today. As someone mentioned yesterday, looking back, we always wish we had the forethought to ask our relatives. I wish I had asked her, what was her thought process? How did she make that decision? But at any rate, railways are important, and they must be considered. And I want to start by thinking about Ireland. The first railroad in Ireland was built in 1834. It was the Dublin to Kingstown route. And railroads developed extremely quickly. By 1920, at the height of the Irish railroads, 3,500 miles of track. And if I can quote him correctly, Patty's told me several times that, at this point in history, there was no village in Ireland more than 30 miles from the railway. And so, as you think about it, this had to have a major impact on the country and on the way of life, and consequently on immigration. And so just to think about some of those things, the impact of the railroad on immigration in Ireland. Now, obviously, as a means of transport to the departing ports is a very obvious one. And in speaking with Brian Mitchell yesterday before he had to leave, he was pointing out that basically before 1850, you walked. I think maybe Dr. McMorrin last night played the lament that she played for us at the Bridge of Tears last year. And that's that iconic image of the immigrant walking, or if you're certainly well-to-do, maybe you had a cart. But after that time, basically the immigrants are going to be taking the railroad. And railroads are going to be working in conjunction, as Christina pointed out, with the shipping lines, and also, as Brian pointed out to me yesterday, the immigration agents who are working in the towns to put together these immigration parties. But railroads had a different effect beyond just transporting immigrants to the departure points. Kirby Miller points out in his brilliant book that in this time period of the railroad development from 1845 to 1920, that imports to Ireland increased from a value of 15 million pounds to 75 million pounds in 1920. And the railroads played a big part in that. So if you think about this flood of goods coming into this country, now all of a sudden throughout the country, because of the railroads, you have manufactured goods, factory-made goods, and foreign-made goods. And it transforms life. You have that accelerated commercialization of rural areas. You have urbanization, more people moving to cities, the deindustrialization of areas. And so it's a real spur to immigration. It's not unlike the globalization that we've seen in our own lifetimes over the last few decades. So if you think about, the classic migration theory of Everett Lee, the push-pull theory, these are massive push factors that are motivating people to leave the island. And so the railroad is playing a more complex role than we might think. And to quote again Kirby Miller, he says, in short, thousands of rural and village craftsmen departed once self-sufficient districts and followed their vanishing customers overseas. As one old man later reminisced in his Donegal townland, formerly there were masons, carpenters, coopers, thatchers, and every kind of tradesman you could name, but they all went into strange and distant lands and never returned since. So the railroad has this incredible effect in Ireland of facilitating the migration, the immigration out. But how about Appalachia? Well, just to remind ourselves of where Appalachia is, if you look at all of the colored area, that's the federal government's definition of Appalachia, over 400 counties. And it's always shifting. It's very strange that one year the county will be considered Appalachian, the next year it won't. So, I don't understand politics, but the old adage, follow the money, and it will explain it. But what we consider, most people when they say Appalachia, they think of this traditional core, the orange colored, from West Virginia down to the top of Georgia and Alabama. And so railroads in this area, you have sort of the reverse effect of what I just described in Ireland. And to look at this, it's hard to see this map, but if you notice, and this is 1851, so it's fairly early on. The first railroad in the U.S. was 1830, so this is 20 years on. And if you see the black lines, certainly across the Midwest and down the coast, railroads are developing. But in Appalachia, you've got a big blank spot because of the terrain and because of the lower population there. But we start to see that change in the latter part of the 19th century. So if you think about the impact of railroads in Appalachia, first of all, they did provide work for immigrant laborers to build and maintain the railroads. And railroads are very convenient place for particularly unattached young men to get quick work because it's unskilled labor, and the railroads were very aggressive in recruiting those immigrants and actually organizing them into groups. Into actual ethnic groups, and sometimes they would have translators to go with these groups as they worked along the railway. Also, railroads are very important catalysts for the development of infrastructure, electric power plants, water systems, gas systems. The railroad is building all of these things because the railroad understands that for the railroad to exist, they must have a demand for transporting freight and goods. And how do they do that? They attract industry. So they're attracting industry. They're designing and building towns. They're also into agriculture. The more agriculture they have along the railway, the more goods are being transported. And so it's really fascinating to dig into these the archives of these railroads and to see all of the ways they're trying to do all of these things. And if you're developing all of those things into the second point, then you're going to need to recruit people to work and to live in those areas. So they become quite active in the recruitment and as well as the obvious transport of immigrants. And then beyond that, the improved communication and connection that railroads provide are absolutely important and essential to the changing of culture and to really, if you think about it in terms of the connection and sort of a uniformization of culture. Railroads, like mass communication will later, radio and TV and internet, it's pulling people together into that common culture. So you have massive pull factors. If the railroad is functioning mainly for push factors in Ireland, then in Appalachia in the United States, these are pull factors of pulling migrants in and then transporting them out into the country. So just briefly to mention 3 examples of railroads in Appalachia and the role that they played and how they connected to Irish immigration. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad is the first railroad in the United States, starts in 1830. As its name would indicate, their entire goal was to connect the port of Baltimore with this huge opening market in Ohio and lands further west. So they start off very ambitiously in 1830, but they don't actually reach the Ohio River until 1852. So it takes a while. You all know Baltimore was one of the primary arrival ports for Irish immigrants. So it's very natural that the primary workforce for the B&O Railroad, if you've ever played Monopoly, you recognize that name, it would be the Irish immigrants. And so the Irish, if you go to Wheeling, West Virginia, which was that stopping point on the Ohio River, Baltimore to Ohio, you will find this Celtic cross along the river there, and it's dedicated to the Irish of the Ohio Valley. And on the reverse side, it says they built the national road to Wheeling in 1818, predating the railroad, and then the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, 1853. Here's a photo of some of those workers. And in Baltimore, you not only have the B&O Museum, which is one of the world's best railroad museums, but you also have the Irish Railroad Workers Museum, which exists to tell that story of those forgotten workers who built that incredible railway. A little further south, and a lesser-known railroad where the Irish played a very important role, the Blue Ridge Railroad, later the Virginia Central Railroad. And it originally was sort of a competitor because the government of Virginia wanted a railroad to connect Richmond to Ohio. I don't know why they didn't call it the Richmond, Ohio Railroad. But anyway, they had a more daunting task, though. They had to cross the higher peaks of the Blue Ridge into the Shenandoah Valley at Stanton and then continue on across into West Virginia. So it was a much slower go. But as they approached that, what's called Afton Mountain at Rockfish Gap, if you ever watched the old show, The Waltons, anyone? You ever hear them talk about rockfish? Well, here's where the name comes from, right? So they had to build 4 tunnels to get over these mountains. And the longest was called the Blue Ridge Tunnel. And this is from Google Maps. You can still see it today because it's now a hiking trail. You can hike through the tunnel. That line there is the tunnel, 0.8 of a mile long. And so 800 plus Irish workers are brought to this site. They live in a sort of a shanty town there on the top of the mountain, and they worked for 8 years to construct this tunnel. And at this time, remember, they're not using dynamite yet. That's in the future. And they're not using concrete to encase these tunnels. They're using hand drills, black powder, and then they're bricking up the tunnel. Shoring it up with timbers and then bricking over that. It's an extremely hard labor and dangerous labor. So you have, as I mentioned, 800 plus Irish working, and a little bit differently from a lot of the stories you hear about the Irish working, say, in the Trans-Pacific Railway, where the great majority of them are unmarried. You actually have a large number of families in this camp, possibly because it's so close to the East Coast. So you have in this shanty town whole families of people living and working there. So they cut their way through this mountain. There are also about 40 enslaved workers as part of this workforce. And at one time, the owners of this railroad tried to actually recruit more enslaved persons to replace the Irish because they could pay not the slaves, but the slave owners less. But very interestingly, the slave owners refused to allow their enslaved persons to work in the most dangerous parts of the tunnel. And the few who were allowed refused to do it. So it was only the Irish who were willing to go in and drill those holes and to build that tunnel in the most dangerous circumstances. We know in Stanton there was already a strong Scots-Irish community. The Presbyterian Church, Old Stone Church, is the oldest continually used Presbyterian church in Virginia. It's right there. But there were also several Catholic families, this is pre-famine, who were located in Stanton, Virginia. And several of those were from Ulster. the Crickard family, the McAleer family. And so in 1841, this is 9 years before they started building the tunnel, Father Daniel Downey arrived, and he founded St. Francis Parish. He stays with the Crickards. When the workers arrive in 1850, he builds a wooden chapel on the mountaintop to serve those workers. And the next year, they've actually built the stone church in Stanton, which is still in function today. And they confirmed 25 young people in 1851. So it's interesting. What you see here is this influx of Catholic railroad workers, majority Catholic, coming in to build this tunnel. They then actually, a number of them end up staying there, and they actually help to build that community in Stanton. The average daily wage for a man would be 75 cents per day and 54 cents for a boy. But the workers found out partway through the project that up in Cincinnati, they're earning a lot more. So they went on strike, and they payday, $1.25 a day for headers. Those are the ones who are building the roof of the tunnel. $1.12.5 for the floors, and 62.5 for boys. So 1850 started. They finished it in 1858. 0.8 of a mile long. Longest tunnel in the U.S. until 1875. 189 recorded deaths in building this tunnel over 8 years. So that includes accidents and illness, including a cholera outbreak, which was very commonly associated with these work camps. It's now recognized as one of an engineering marvel in the United States, that particular tunnel. And then one final example, a little further south in a little later period, is the Carolina, Clinchfield, and Ohio Railroad, the CC&O. So 1890, you see all the red lines. The U.S. is really crisscrossed with railroads, but you still got a blank spot there, don't you? Yeah. So right up in here in the corner where all these states come together, that's Johnson City, but there's no railway to bring the coal from Kentucky straight down to South Carolina and to the port of Charleston. And that's what the CC&O is all about. There were several attempts to build this, but it's finally completed in 1915. And it's completed by a fellow named George Lafayette Carter. He's a rags to riches story, started as a shopkeeper and becomes this coal and railroad magnate. And so he owns the Clinchfield Railroad. His father was Walter Crockett Carter. His uncle was Robert Crockett Carter. His grandmother was Jane Crockett Carter. Is there an Ulster connection there? And we've got a Crockett over here, don't we? Or a Crockett relative. Possibly. And of course, this is very imprecise, but just out of curiosity, we don't have a roster of all the workers on the railway, but we do have a personal injury file. And I went through those files of 359 names, and at least 27% could be typical Ulster Scots surnames. We know there was a strong Ulster Scots community in that area. And then if you look at place names, here's the train schedule, and I'll zoom in for you. You recognize a name there that might be nearby? Dungannon. There you go. So the Clinchfield was incredibly important and powerful in developing this part of Appalachia. They hired urban planners to develop cities like Kingsport. There's the blueprints in our archives of Appalachia. They recruited furniture factories. The Southern Pottery Plant. They built this whole facility and recruited workers from Ohio, mainly women, to hand paint these plates and dishes. It becomes highly collectible. They bring in, again, an urban planner to build a whole row of company houses, which this is that same row. That's 1915. That's today. These are very desirable houses now. They actually built them to a very high quality, and this is very collectible stoneware, this Blue Ridge pottery. And then they had what was called the Clinchfield Immigration Society. This was a group associated with the railroad expressly designed to recruit immigrants to live along the railway. A whole file of personal letters of people looking for work or thinking about relocating. They write to the railroad, and it's amazing to read their letters and the replies. This is a man in High Point, North Carolina, on the eastern side of the Blue Ridge. He's got 4 children, and he's writing to say, hey, is the silk mill open yet? I've got 2 boys and 2 girls who know how to work. Can we get work? And the railroad answers these things. So to go back to Ireland, and this is a neat site I found at the Atlantic Technological University. You can kind of play around with the overlays of these maps. But here are the historic railways of Ireland. As we said, everyone's connected. And if you think about Oma, now help me out here. Where are we? Right in here? This is a place where railroads came together and then ran up the Foyle Valley to Derry. And Liam, I think I'm correct in saying that we're standing on the railway right here. So not only is this a place that's dedicated to the study and understanding of migration, but we're actually standing on a spot where thousands of immigrants passed by, headed to their next life. And then, as in America, you've had a decline of railways. Ireland has about half the track miles it had at its height in 1920. And if you notice the big blank spot, it's right up here in the north and the west. So for us, I think one of our challenges is to make sure we preserve this heritage. This is part of the immigrant story, and it's a very important part. So we need to study it more. There needs to be more research, I think. I think, as Christina was pointing out earlier today, most of the research and the writing about railroads is about sort of the commercial history or the technological history. It's not so much about the human history of railways. There are some great institutions trying to preserve railway heritage in both the States and here in Ireland, and I've been lucky to visit two of those sites. And as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to start this railroad experience in Johnson City. We've got a lot of railroad artifacts and model railways as well. Historically accurate. Now, that one's not historically accurate because it has dinosaurs on top of it. But, hey, dinosaurs lived there at one time, didn't they? But anyway, the kids like it. But this particular one is kind of the centerpiece. It's based on a narrow gauge railroad, and it's historically accurate down to details based on historical photographs. And I'll close with this one story. We had a woman in her 90s who came in to look at this model railway, and she paused and and this is Dr. Fred Alsop, by the way, the primary director of the museum. You remember him, Liam. But she looked at this one particular spot on the display where it showed a family with two little children. And it was based on the 1920s. So you had a 1920 automobile, and they're standing there. It was taken from an actual photograph. And she looked at it for a while, and she said, you know, the color of the coat is wrong. Because she was that little girl. And her story is fascinating. She went on, she was the first licensed woman driver in Carter County, Tennessee, and then got her pilot's license, one of the first female pilots of East Tennessee, later retired to Florida. She came back and visited this little site, and she saw herself in this model train. And I think that's what heritage is all about. It's about memory, but it's about keeping those memories alive. And what can we learn about it, and what can we teach future generations about the role of railroads? So thank you very much.
We've looked at transport by sea, we've looked at transport by rail, and now Heather Montgomery is going to take us into space. Heather is a retired midwife. Now works as a casual tour guide here at the Ulster American Folk Park. She's very much involved in local history. She's a stalwart of the Ochnacloy Historical Society. And Heather's going to speak to us about a Tyrone man, we'll just call him a Tyrone man, who made it into space. Thank you very much, Heather.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I don't really call myself a historian. Yes, I do tour guiding out in buses, and I work here in the folk park. And thank Liam and Paddy for allowing me to present the life of Jim Irwin, who lived from 1930 to 1991, an American astronaut. James Benson Jim Irwin, born 17th of March 1930 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, US. His father, James Irwin, was of Irish descent, and his mother, Elsa Matilda Stribel, if I'm pronouncing it right, was of Scottish descent. His father was a plumber who moved to Florida, then Salt Lake City, then San Jose in California. Jim's grandparents came from Altmore Parish near Pomeroy in County Tyrone and emigrated to America around 1859, who left the old world to go to the new world. When Jim was growing up, he was always interested in the world around him and the world of space. He was 5'8", slim and dark hair. And when he was 12 years old, he informed his mother he longed to go to the moon, informing her he might be the first to do this. And as it turned out, he was the 8th person to walk the moon out of only 12 men on the moon anyway. Education. He graduated from East High School, Salt Lake City, Utah in 1947. Then got a Bachelor of Science degree in Naval Science from the US Naval Academy in 1951. Later gained a master's degree in Aeronautical and Instrumentational Engineering, Michigan University in 1957. Marriages. First wife, James met Mary Etta Weshline in Texas and later wed in December 1952. Divorced then in 1954 because of religious conflicts. Jim was a Baptist and Mary a Roman Catholic. But he happened to meet a second wife, Mary too, Ellen Monroe, whom he wed on the 4th of September 1959. And it's actually just by sheer coincidence I myself was married on the 4th of September 1979, 20 years later. But anyway, Jim married a photographer's model whom he had 5 children with, all named with the letter J. Joy, Jill, and again it's just by sheer coincidence I have a daughter called Jill. James, Jan and Joe. And he stayed with this Mary until his death. And I do have one of his books, and I was just looking at it there over my breakfast before I left home this morning. I see an awful fear of meeting girls in his teenage years, but ended up with 2 marriages. His career. So in later life, he was an American astronaut, an aeronautical engineer, a test pilot apparently was his main occupation, and a US Air Force pilot. And as a test pilot, he admitted he was a show-off. He was part of a small team lunar module pilot aboard Apollo 15 from the 26th of July to the 7th of August 1971, which left Houston in US and returned to Earth by splashing down in the Pacific Ocean. It was the 4th human lunar landing. He was the 8th person to walk the moon, along with David Scott, mission commander, and Alfred Worden, command module pilot on that trip. And that's them there, and I have newspaper cuttings with me too, if you want to see that afterwards. Trip to the moon. First footsteps and his first words on the moon. I felt very special when I looked down at my footprints on the moon. The scientists said that they would be there for 1 million years. Earth looked like a Christmas tree when departing, but further away it diminished in size. Finally, Earth shrank to the size of a marble. It was so beautiful and far away, and yet I felt strangely at home on the moon. It is reported that Colonel Irwin was the only man to have quoted the Bible on the moon, especially Psalm 121. My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And as he walked the moon, he placed a shamrock on the ground to honour his Irish heritage. A rocky terrain with crater pits, but could drive a Dune rover buggy, which could fold up into a compartment in Apollo. And if the rover broke down, the astronauts would have enough resources in life support systems to walk back to the lunar module. Now, life on the moon. He was the first man to drive the new vehicle on that surface. It went at 8 miles an hour, a bouncy ride. And while there, they collected 175 pounds of rock surface. They spent 12 and a half days in space and 66 hours, 54 minutes actually on the moon. And they gathered the Genesis rock, a place of the moon's crust that is more than 4 billion years old. Jim filmed an extraordinary event while on the moon's surface. The footage appears to show a landed flying saucer parked on the lunar surface in the background of the shot observing US Space Agency operation. They carried 26 layers of materials on their bodies designed to protect them from extreme temperatures. And they were the first astronauts to get a sound sleep on the moon because they could take these suits off inside the lunar module. And while there, he experienced irregular heartbeats, but did make it back to Earth again. Jim retired from NASA, National Aeronautics Space Administration, 31st of July 1972. And again, it's by sheer coincidence, 31st of July, 10 years later, in 1982, my daughter Jill was born. He accumulated more than 7,015 hours flying time during his military service. And there he is on the moon. Now, he went on to visit around the world. 1973, Jim went with an expedition to Mount Ararat, Turkey, in search of Noah's Ark. The same journey repeated 5 times after, but no evidence found. On one of these occasions, 1982, he reached the 16,946-foot summit, but he fell on the glacier, suffering severe leg and face lacerations. He had to be transported down the mountain on horseback. Now, after that, he travelled the world and met world leaders, including President Nixon and the White House and King Hussein of Jordan. And that's Jim there at the edge there and here in this upper one. And there he is again, just travelling the world and waving to the crowds. Now, he did visit to County Tyrone. He visited Pomeroy for 3 days in September 1979. And it is the highest village in Northern Ireland and is the centre of Ulster. It is 17 miles from where we are now. During this time, he found out that on the 29th of April 1879, the marriage took place in Alta Desert Parish Church, which is actually in the centre of Pomeroy, of John Irwin of Altmore, farmer, son of Thomas Irwin, and he got married to a Mary Jane Benson, daughter of Matthew Benson of Turnabarson. Jim visited the ancestral home and met many local relatives during this trip. One of them, my daughter Jill, who I've talked about, her mother-in-law, Sadie Boyd, who turned 85 just last Thursday. She was née Irwin, and she was there to greet him, her second cousin. So that's what has inspired me on to research this man. There was great media interest with newspapers and many TV stations covering the story. There was many crowds on the street of Pomeroy to greet him. He was a little bit late and joked to the crowd that it was easier getting to the moon than it was getting to Pomeroy. And just by sheer coincidence, when I was going out to my car yesterday evening to go home, your neighbour, was it Leslie?
Leslie Craig.
Leslie Craig was getting into his car. I happened to say, I'm talking tomorrow about James Irwin. He happened to tell me about Barney McCool in the Tyrone Constitution, made a comment that it was a traffic warden delayed him in getting to Pomeroy. And he said to the traffic warden, well, this man has been somewhere where you have never been. So it was Leslie told me that just yesterday evening. While he was here, he gave talks about his experience and what it was like on the moon. He was the first astronaut to drive a car known as a lunar rover on the moon. Joseph Benson, a relative on his maternal grandmother's side, said after he returned to the US, he kept in touch with my father and other Northern Ireland relatives. And this man apparently has a retired hardware business and lots of memorabilia from his cousin's visit in Moneymore. But I'm sorry, I don't know that person at all. And just to point out Tyrone and Pomeroy, where the location is. Caught on camera, moonwalker in mountains of Pomeroy, and a few other wee ones greeting his relative, a Mrs. Mary Irwin. I don't know of her. But this is the old homestead presently now. Jim's grandparents' homestead in Pomeroy, still owned by the Irwin family. A man called Robin lives in it, and I was there just on the 23rd of May this year. James Irwin's grandparents went to school in Altanock, and that's at a private house that I also saw there in May. Now we're coming on to technology and the internet day. www.High Flight Foundation. His second career in 1972, Colonel James B. Irwin founded the High Flight Foundation, a Colorado Springs-based religious interdenominational Christian foundation, dedicated to share the good news that God walking on the earth is more important than man walking on the moon. Jim frequently commented about how his experiences in space had made the presence of God even more real to him than before, and this saved his second marriage and made their lives much happier. Now, his health and final days. He suffered 4 major heart attacks. Number 1 occurred less than 2 years after Apollo 15, age 46, playing handball, and he underwent triple bypass heart surgery. Number 2, 2 months later, suffered another heart attack while skiing in Colorado. And then in 1986, number 3, he suffered another heart attack, collapsed, and was found to have no pulse, but did recover again. Then, on the 8th of August 1991, after a bike ride in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, Jim suffered number 4 heart attack. Resuscitation was unsuccessful, and sadly he died later that day, aged 61. Jim was the first and the youngest astronauts to die, and he is survived by his wife Mary Ellen and their 5 children. He is interred in Section 3 of Arlington National Cemetery in Washington. He's also an author. There is a few more books, but this is the one that I have, To Rule the Night. Seems to be very interesting. Fred Hoyle, some of you might have heard of him, an English astronomer. He said that space isn't remote at all. It's only an hour's drive away if your car could go straight upwards. Now, to bring you up to 2024, these is my own 3 wee grandchildren. I'd mentioned my daughter Jill. I have 2 sons, but I've just the one daughter, and Jill's children and I visited Armagh Planetarium, where certainly James Irwin is recognised there. Again, just to bring us right up to this month, June 2024, I am a widow, I live alone, and I have the radio on quite a lot at home. And just on the news, the China National Space Administration landed on the moon around the 2nd of June 2024 at 6:23 a.m. Chinese time, but it was actually the 1st of June, 6:23 p.m. UK time. And they touched down in a huge crater known as the South Pole Aitken Basin. And just a few days after it, again, I heard it on the news, Apollo 8 astronaut Bill Anders, who snapped one of the most famous photographs taken in outer space, aged 90, died on the 7th of June, just past, in a small plane crash. He was piloting and crashed off the coast of Washington State. And just to bring you up, here is Sadie, my daughter's mother-in-law. Sadly, her husband died a number of years ago. Her youngest son, Alan, who's married to Jill, my daughter, and this was their Sarah Jane, Olivia and Emily. And to bring us up to this year, we're delighted we greeted Lily into the family and her 2 proud grannies. Sadly, we're both widows, with latest addition to the Boyd family, Lily, another descendant of Jim Irwin. And just a few references to Rule the Night. Norman Irwin, I went to visit, an 80-year-old man there, a brother of Sadie's there just in Pomeroy at the end of May, and of course of the website, and I've been to Armagh Planetarium, and of course thanks to the internet these days too. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Heather. Although you modestly disclaim being a historian, you've given us a wonderful presentation that, has literally taken us to the moon and back. So thank you very much.
Now is the hour, now is the day. We take what we gather and set on our way. And hope for what's better, that's what people say. But words can't do nothing to keep tears away. Come by the mountains, cross over the streams, walk in the footsteps of others who've dreamed. Take your bag from the fire, your coat from the door, keep a light in the window, from the fire, you're cold from the door. Keep alive.